Today, I'm going to use plywood, hardwood lumber, and slabs to build 5 of my favorite desks that I've ever designed. And we're going to start with this giant L-shaped desk that actually used 2 live edge walnut slabs. So I got these from the same place that I got the last walnut slab, which is a place called GL Veneer. And I was looking through their inventory online, and initially I wanted to get this pair, which were numbered 73 and 74. But unfortunately, before I could claim it, somebody grabbed 73. So instead I got 72 and 74. And I think that basically means that when they were a tree that got turned into slabs, they would have been numbered something like this. So instead of being first cousins, they're second cousins, which I don't think will be a problem, unless they want to get married. Anyway, regardless of where you live, anybody can go on GL Veneer's website and browse their inventory, which I highly recommend, by the way. It's fun to dream about some of the crazier pieces they've got. That said, this was the first time that we actually went there in person to pick up slabs and have them flattened, and it's pretty wild. Definitely beats using a random orbit sander. So pretty much the first thing that I like doing on any of these projects is to get rid of all the stuff that I know isn't going to be in the final piece. And that's because pretty much 98% of making a slab top is essentially taking something that's rough and dirty and falling apart and making it smooth, clean, and keeping it together so that it can be a functional table. In other words, removing the bad stuff and cleaning up the good stuff. So if I can remove, say, about 15% of the material right off the bat, then I can save myself probably 15% of the total time that I'm going to spend cleaning things up. And to be completely honest, I don't really have a good handle of how many hours that is. People always ask how long my projects take me, and I feel like I never have a good answer, mainly because since I'm filming everything, it's a lot longer than what it probably should be. But just to take a semi-educated guess, if I weren't filming, something like the haul table from the last video was probably 3 solid work days for the top, another 3 for the base, plus another day for touch-up, sanding, and finishing. So I'd say about 60 hours of work. By the way, if you saw that video, then you'll remember that I auctioned that piece off and gave all the money to charity, and we ended up raising $5,000. But that didn't stop somebody from saying that the table should have been worth $300 at most. So 60 hours of work, not including filming and editing, for a table that's worth $300 max. Not counting cost of materials, that means I'm making $5 an hour. Which actually, my first job ever at a Subway sandwich franchise in 1996, I think that is about what I got. The more things change, the more they stay the same. At this point, all of the cutting that I'm doing is very rough. I'm not trying to hit any finished dimensions or anything like that. Everything's still way oversized. The miters probably aren't 45 degrees. I'm really just getting rid of the stuff that I know I don't need. And that's because, as I said a minute ago, a huge percentage of the time I spend on these slabs is going to be cleaning them up. And on this one in particular, a lot of that time was dedicated to this, what is apparently called a gallery. And this is something that might have started its life as like a pruning wound, and then bugs get in there and attack the area and it turns into a big hole. Now, I seriously considered just taking a hammer to this part of the slab because most of it you're never going to see once it's filled with black epoxy. But the reason that I didn't is because I was worried that the overall shape would end up looking really man-made in the end. And I guess I want it to look like it was shaped by bugs and Mother Nature instead of me. So once that part was clean, then I had to clean up the rest of the slab plus the whole other one. And this takes a long time, so I'm not going to subject you to watching any of it in real time. Except for maybe this one shot, just because the setting sun spilling through the roll-up door was too cinematic to just speed through. So for this epoxy pour, I'm not going to be building any forms because there's no major river running through the slabs. It's really just one big lake and a few little ponds. So by using tape and a few strategically placed pieces of melamine, I should be able to get the job done. And you can see in this shot that I was trying to beat the clock to get my epoxy poured, and this was a bad idea. So I reconvened and let things set up overnight, and then got to the pour the next morning. And I did this pour a little differently than how I have in the past. So here what I'm mixing up is Total Boat high performance epoxy with slow hardener. Now, even though this stuff is called slow hardener, it's still going to be cured enough that I can keep working on it within a day. So in the pool area, I'm going to start by filling in the bug holes and get just the bottom maybe 1/4 inch or so of the big open area, and then fill in some knot holes and other little bug hole areas as well. Then the next day, I'm going to switch over to deep pour, and I'll use that to completely fill up the pool area, top off all the major cracks, and get everything else flush with the top. And this stuff is going to take several days to cure enough that I can keep working on it. So you might be wondering why not just use one or the other for the entire pour, and there's a few reasons. With the slow hardener, which remember is the one that actually cures fast, the biggest downside in this situation is that you can only pour it 1/4 inch deep at a time. One of the advantages of the slow hardener though is that even right off the bat, it's quite a bit thicker than deep pour. And also within about an hour, the slow hardener turns into sort of a gel-like consistency, whereas the deep pour is going to stay like water for basically a day. So the way that I sealed these slabs up for the pour, I would say was good, but not great. So if there is a potential for a leak somewhere, by pouring the slow hardener first, it's going to kind of get in there and seal up. And maybe a couple drops will come out. Now, in terms of the quality of the finished results, I honestly don't know if one of them really looks any better than the other. But my hunch is that since I'm tinting everything black and it's pretty opaque, it doesn't really make a difference. Okay, in that last whole section, I was only cleaning up one of the slabs. And the reason for that is the other slab has a really big problem on the underside. And these are 2 really large shallow spots. And this is probably the reason that slab 73 and 74 both cost over $1,600, while this slab, number 72, was about $400 cheaper. So in this shot, you can see that the shallow spots maxed out at about 3/4 inch thinner than the rest of the slab. And one solution would have been to build a form and fill this up with epoxy. But I didn't want to do that because this part of the slab is very structural, and you'll see later that a lot of hardware is going to get attached here, and I'd rather have wood for that to go into. So I took a bunch of offcuts of walnut that we had laying around and used my planer to thin them out to about 1/4 inch. That way they're going to be thin enough to conform to the curvature of the slab. And then I cut those into a bunch of smaller pieces that'll take up like 90% of the area that needs to be filled in. So to initially attach these, I used a light layer of epoxy, and I knew that there was no way that I was going to get them perfectly laminated on. So after the epoxy dried, I came back and drilled in a bunch of, we'll call them access ports. That way when I pour the epoxy, it'll get in everywhere and make a good surface for the infrastructure of the desk. Now, having slab 72 instead of 73 might be something that some people would be upset about, but I'm actually happy about it now. First, because I'm confident that in the end, this isn't going to be a problem, but mainly because I think of the 3 slabs, this one actually turned out to be the most interesting looking of the bunch. So to the person running the sawmill that day that caused this happy accident, thank you. Anyway, from here, next I took them down to Street Tree Revival to throw them up on the wood whiz to get flattened. And if you've never heard of a wood whiz, kind of like me until 3 months ago, it's basically a slab flattening jig with a router that's on steroids. So at this point, the slabs still don't look very good, and they still need a ton of work. But from a structural point of view, we're actually looking pretty good, which means that we can finally start making the critical cuts. And the first of those is going to be the miter joint that's going to join the 2 slabs together. And after making the first of these cuts, here you can see the result of filling in that huge shallow spot on the miter. And is it pretty? Not really. But is it functional? I think so. And does it really matter if it's pretty? No, because you're not going to see it once the desk is all together. And do you hate it when people ask and answer their own questions in a voiceover because it's annoying? Probably. So will I stop now? Yeah. So with the miters looking good, next I have to cut the slabs to their final widths. And initially I had planned that I was going to do this with the track saw as well, but the slabs actually turned out to be quite a bit lighter than what I thought they would be. So I was able to use my table saw instead to get a more consistent result. The next thing that I need to do is use this domino connect hardware to attach the slabs together in a non-permanent way. And I do this about once a year, and every time I need to relearn it, and it's kind of a big pain. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to use the next minute as a sort of cheat sheet that I can refer to next time. Okay, first up, make sure you're using the 8mm bit. Next, mark all the places you're going to cut mortises along your joint and alternate between regular dominoes and the Connect hardware. Now set the domino cutter to plunge 15mm deep, then cut all the mortises you labeled C on just one of the slabs. Then change the plunge depth to 28mm and cut the mortises labeled C on the other slab. Next, flip the workpiece over so that the bottom is facing up, and then use the provided drilling jig to drill holes in the same slab that you would cut the deeper mortises into. Now you can install the metal part of the hardware into the 15mm deep mortises, tapping it flush. Then install the metal block thingy and the plastic clip on the bob into the 28mm deep mortises. Next, install the male part, making sure that the flat spot faces the hole. And then use this little set screw to draw everything tight. Now, if you have any questions, hop in a DeLorean and set the flux capacitor to Sunday, December 20th, 2022 at 8:11 a.m. West Coast time. This is the best you're ever going to understand this, so find him and ask. Give it here. The reason that we're building this desk in the first place is because a guy named Robert had reached out after seeing our video on this desk and asked if we could build him something similar, only much, much bigger. And obviously we said yes. So after he gave us all of his requirements, here's what we came up with. In my last video, I had tested out buying lumber online for the first time, and that project didn't really require a ton of wood, but this project does. Actually, here's a shot of the little file that I made myself for figuring out how much it needed exactly. So I'm not going to make any claims yet, but so far, I am liking the convenience of ordering online and having it all show up at my door. And this isn't a sponsorship, but the place that I've been testing is called Woodworkers Source. And for now, I'm going to keep testing them and I'll update you on my experience as we go. Okay, now it's time to talk about the elephant in the room. So the guy you see building stuff on your screen right now is Sean. I'm Chris. We're two different people. Anyway, in the last few videos, longtime viewers had noticed that they haven't been seeing much Sean, which led to a lot of questions. And I couldn't really talk about it, and honestly, it's really more of his place than it is mine, but I can say a few things. And I guess really the main takeaway would be that Sean is going to be stepping away from the Four Eyes channel to restart his channel. And that might sound dramatic, but really it's not. He's literally sitting 3 feet away from me right now at his computer. We ate fish tacos for lunch. They were good. So he's still my friend. He's still my business partner on our woodworking plans. There's even a good chance that we'll still collaborate on projects like this from time to time. He just won't be posting on the Four Eyes channel anymore. And really most of that has to do with geography. Basically, there's a good chance that he's going to have to move in the not too distant future. And we don't know when that is, but rather than waiting for it to happen and then scrambling, we figured we'd take a more active approach and get his channel going again. So probably more than any other single project that I've built, this desk has to be able to come apart and go back together easily and repeatedly. Moving it as one giant piece would take like 8 people who were extremely in sync with one another. Otherwise, they'd probably break something. Not to mention that even if that were possible, it's not going to really fit through many doors. So Sean has everything covered in terms of the base, but for the top, I'm going to need to create a series of attachment plates. Now, I've made things like this in the past, and here I need to make 4 identical plates and one similar but slightly different plate at the corner. So rather than standing in front of my drill press for several hours, I decided to sit at my computer for about 30 minutes to draw up a file, and then spent another hour or so using the CNC to drill out all the holes, except for these tapered countersinks. Those I did at the drill press. And almost immediately after creating the plates, I had the realization that half of the holes that I made were basically inaccessible because of the desk's cabinets. So then I had to cut off all the holes that we won't be able to get to. Live and learn, I guess. So the other day I got a DM from somebody letting me know that they saw someone selling my spider table on Marketplace. So they sent me a link and I took a look, and I can't say for sure if this is the spider table. And anyway, this specific example aside, I actually get a lot of messages from people saying this person is copying your design or this person stole this, yada, yada, yada. And my stance is always good. I make videos about designing and building furniture with the hopes that millions of people will watch them and that some of the people will feel inspired or motivated to go build something. And if that something is completely new and original, inspired by something they saw me build, or a straight up one-for-one replica of something they saw me build, I'm good with all of that. Actually, I'm more than good with it. I want it to happen. And this is something that I've thought about a lot. And that is the idea of people selling a replica of something that I've designed. And I would say that where I've settled is, as long as it's not a big company doing it, I'm fine with it. This guy selling the spider table, that's fine. Maybe he's trying to get better, and if he can subsidize the cost of furthering his craft by selling this table, that's great. In fact, I think my exact reply after seeing that they were selling it for $450 was, that's a good deal. But he did mess up the standoffs. That's this part right here, by the way. People always want to make them a lot taller, but a little goes a long way. Now, that said, if I woke up tomorrow morning and IKEA had a Four Eyes furniture line, I'd probably feel a little different. I think I'd want in on the action. In fact, if anybody out there from IKEA is watching this and wants to collaborate, vi gjør det. Anyway, I guess this is all a really long way of saying, if you ever want to build anything that you see me building, you don't have to ask. You have my permission. And in fact, I'll make it really easy for you. Here are 14 pieces that we've made insanely detailed instructions for that'll walk you through every single step of building them. So that not only will you be successful in building the piece, but you'll learn new skills that you can carry with you for the rest of your woodworking career. In other words, these are our woodworking plans, and I'll have a link in the description. Okay, so at this point, structurally speaking, this desk is a tank. But there is one part that I'm slightly concerned about, and that's this inside corner of the top. So in order to tankify this part, like the rest of the desk, I decided to install a few pieces of C-channel that'll bridge the joint. And by the way, if you ever want to see the ultimate face of concentration, that's it right there. Or maybe that's constipation. Either way, after cutting everything in, just like with the attachment plates, I used my Rockler portable drill guide to install some threaded inserts to attach everything. And if it isn't obvious by now, I'd say this tool is the real star of the show on this build. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's going to be a replacement for a drill press in every situation, but I can truthfully say that I personally spent $1,700 on a drill press that gets used way less than this thing, which only cost 1/10 as much. Though I suppose in fairness, you can't really rank tools by usefulness per dollar. If you did though, I guess the winner in my book might be a random orbit sander, and the loser might be something like this edge sander. Maybe. I don't know. Might be an interesting thought experiment to ponder someday. But that aside, what I'm doing here is all of the touch-up work on the slab. And I'm using a small nail to try to get as much epoxy down into every little possible hole. But some holes you just can't fill with epoxy. So for those, I'm going to use this stuff called hot melt, which I think is basically like a black glue stick. And even though it's thicker than liquid epoxy is, you can kind of force it down into the little holes and cracks. And I would guess that this stuff isn't nearly as hard as epoxy is, but it's definitely hard enough. You're only going to dent it if you were to stab into it with a screwdriver or something. But also wood will dent if you stab into it with a screwdriver. So it's fine. Also, possible dark horse in the usefulness per dollar tool tournament, the screwdriver. All right, now something that is undeniable is that I am an idiot. But I want to know if I'm in the wrong here or if the company is in the wrong. So I'm not going to name them because I don't want to throw anybody under a bus. But for this desk, I ordered a 2 3/4 inch solid brass grommet. Solid brass. That's how they described it on the website. I wanted brushed, but they didn't have it. But I figured I could brush it myself with some light sanding. Except for when I did that, all the brass came off. So is this solid brass? My guess is no, but honestly I have no idea. Maybe that's just how brass is. But my suspicion is that it's brass plated nickel. So I guess the moral of the story is, if you want a solid brass grommet, make sure it's not just brass plated nickel trying to pull a fast one on you. Otherwise, you might end up brushing your grommet instead of brushing it. Now, if that joke didn't make sense, there's a good reason. It was created by artificial intelligence and it's not that funny. Yet. This slab is kind of boring. Actually, it's not even an entire slab. It's just the leftover chunk from a pretty interesting looking slab. The one that we used to build the circle table a couple weeks back. So what do you do when your wood is underwhelming? You overcompensate. But before we do anything, boring or interesting, first we have to deal with some rotten wood. Pretty much what we found is that functionally the wood is totally usable, it just doesn't look good. So our solution here was to remove any of the bad wood from the surface and about 1/2 inch down from there. That way you're not going to have to see any of it in the finished piece, but we still have the benefit of not having to use as much epoxy to fill in the gap. So thank you to everybody who gave us input about that on the last videos. Now, something we weren't thrilled about is how when we were removing the wood, it kind of ended here with this less natural looking break. And there were two ways we could go. Either leave it as is or try to kind of feather it into a more natural bottleneck, like you see me drawing with my finger here. So we decided to leave it, and now we'll just have to wait until we see the finished piece to know if that was the right decision. And when you see the finished piece, you can let us know. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but this slab is going to end up becoming a desk, and it's going to be for sale. So basically, I have no idea where it'll end up or how it's going to be used. Actually, let me rephrase that. I have a pretty good idea of how it'll be used, but I don't know specifically if the person who gets it will put it up against a wall or put it in the middle of a room where you can see it from every side. And because of that, the big question now is, do we cut straight lines on the edges or leave them natural? So thankfully, the piece is pretty rectangular. Basically, on one edge, there's this long, subtle curve, and this is where I would imagine a person will sit. Then on the other edge, it's close to straight. And I think that either option will be fine in the end, but if it goes in the center of the room, I do think that the natural edge is definitely cooler. And if it goes against a wall, the natural edge is still flat enough that it's not going to look too weird. So here we're just following the natural shape of the edges and removing any knots and the softer wood that's just below the bark, which I think is called phloem. And if you're wondering if I had to just look that up, the answer is yes. Up until 30 seconds ago, I thought phloem was just a kind of slime alternative that Nickelodeon made in the 90s. Because we didn't cut any straight edges onto our slab, that means we can't build a normal form for pouring epoxy. So instead, we're going to make a partial form around the slab by just attaching a few pieces of melamine to it. So that's what you see us doing in these shots. And if you're ever thinking about skipping this step and just using tape, here's why that's a bad idea. Epoxy is expensive. Actually, I got curious and started thinking about other expensive liquids that you can buy for comparison's sake. And I don't know why, but for whatever reason, the first place that my mind went was Fiji water, which I've never tasted, but based on price must be good. But as expensive as it is, epoxy still blows it out of the, well, water. Also, I just realized that I don't think the rest of the world uses gallons, so here are those prices in liters. Also, I guess the rest of the world doesn't use the US dollar either, so here are some conversions to a few other currencies. If you want to know others, that's on you. All of that said, in our past couple videos, we received a bunch of comments from you saying that we should check out Blacktail Studios if we want to do more of these slab and epoxy projects. So we took that advice and actually got and went through his entire epoxy workshop course. And after doing that, I'll say that if you ever plan on doing this sort of work and want a super thorough resource, I highly recommend it. Honestly, I did the math and the price of the course is equal to about 1.08 gallons of the epoxy that we use. So basically, if it saves you from making one bad mistake, then it's already paid for itself. So yeah, if you're thinking about doing this kind of work, check it out. I think it's legitimately valuable info, and the more attention that it gets, the better. At this point, our epoxy's been curing for about 48 hours, and you can see that it's still about 1/2 of an inch below the top of the slab. So we're using a product called Fathom Thickset from Total Boat, which can be poured up to 2 inches thick. And since our slab is just barely over 2 inches, we probably could have done it all in one pour. But honestly, you almost always end up having to do a second small touch-up pour anyway. So whether that second pour ends up being 1/2 inch or 1/8 of an inch, you're still doing a second pour, so it doesn't really matter. Also, have you heard of trypophobia? I hadn't. But apparently it's the fear or disgust of closely packed holes. And I guess popping epoxy bubbles in slow motion can trigger it. So there was your complimentary trypophobia warning. Now, I don't like to brag, but Sean and I are pretty good at building forms. I mean, when we build a form and pour epoxy, nothing comes out of it. Literally. Like, not even the slab that we're trying to take out of it. Which is why longtime viewers might remember that in the last video, we had to use a power planer to pulverize the entire sheet of melamine that we bonded to our slab. Which might look kind of satisfying in a replay that's like 1,000 times faster than real life, but it's not fun. So we were really hoping that with these pours, the tape would prevent that from happening again, and there she goes. It did.
Yeah, we did it.
Let's see if the other side does the same thing. Then it didn't. But only because I whiffed on my first attempt, but once I actually hit it, we were all good. So I'd say this was a solid 900% improvement, but I think that next time we'll go for tape and either mold release or wax. And just for old time's sake, we decided to bust out the power planer just to remove some of the extra epoxy on the top. Actually, the real reason we did that is because we're going to flatten this slab on our CNC, and epoxy ruins bits faster than wood does. Speaking of that, this one was a pain. So maybe you've noticed, but now on YouTube, if you hover your mouse over the timeline on the video that you're watching, you'll see a graph that shows the most popular parts of the video. Well, in our last video, the most replayed part was us flattening the slab on the CNC. So naturally I thought, oh man, we got to flatten slabs more. So long story short, if you ever want to mess with me, just keep re-watching a random part of one of our videos, and then I'll think that there's something magical about it and waste a bunch of time trying to recreate it. And everybody wins. Something we've realized with these epoxy slab projects is that there's a lot of hoping involved. Like whenever we've built a more traditional piece of furniture, we have a pretty good idea of how it's going to turn out, how long it'll last under normal wear and tear, and that kind of stuff. But take what we're doing here, for example, which is filling in some cracks on the underside that we couldn't get to at first. Well, is it even necessary? Probably not. But it's also probably a good idea to get as many filled as you can. Or what about adding this C channel? Is that necessary? Again, probably not. This piece isn't that wide, but we had a few leftover pieces from our last project that were almost the perfect length, so why not use them? It's almost like there's these 20 things that you can do to get a perfect epoxy slab table, and you don't have to do all 20, and for any given project, maybe 5 of them might be totally unnecessary. But you just do all 20 anyway, and you hope. A minute ago, I mentioned that the slab is going to become a desk. And a couple videos back, we teased 3 potential designs, and this one got the most votes. But this was still a really rough idea, so we kept designing, and coming up with this idea where the cabinet is leaning is where things really took off. So we kept playing with that before eventually trying the leaning cabinet paired with the design that people had voted for, and after seeing those together, that felt like the way to go. By the way, I should also mention that in addition to votes for which desk you liked best, some people had some write-in ideas, and one person even suggested using the slab as fuel for a bonfire, which I think they meant as a mean comment, but it's kind of funny, so kudos to you, Approval 89. The legs we're building for this desk are, I think, really cool looking, but kind of intimidating when you first see them. But they really aren't nearly as hard to make as they might look. Honestly, I would say that the hardest part of making these kinds of shapes is just creating the templates. But once you have the template, no matter how simple or complex the shape is, the workflow is basically the same. At this point, all we've done is trace out our template shapes onto our workpieces and then cut them out, leaving everything oversized on the bandsaw. Then from there, we used our table saw to cut just the 2 mating joint faces. And now we can go ahead and glue everything together. So things are still really rough at this point, but we're going to let the glue dry for now so that we can continue shaping these tomorrow. Well, tomorrow for me, but a couple minutes for you. We're going to just fly through this section pretty quickly. I will say though, if you do want to get into woodworking and furniture making, building flat panels and building good boxes are arguably the 2 most important skills that you can have. Also, one thing I'll add, just because I don't think we had them at the time that we recorded the other video, is if you get super into panel making, especially larger panels, check out something like these Rockler panel clamps. They're unique in that they squeeze both in and, well, in, or maybe down, I guess. This way and this way. You know what I mean? Anyway, then for the box, something that you probably noticed by now is that instead of being a rectangle, it's a parallelogram. So that just means instead of cutting a bunch of 45-degree angles to create 90-degree corners, we want to create 80 and 100-degree corners. So we need to cut 40 and 50-degree angles instead. And you'll see that in order to do this, Sean is using this jig so that we can cut the workpiece vertically. Now we're about to do something that could potentially ruin all of the work we've done on the legs so far. And it's such a subtle detail, we could probably have skipped it and nobody would even notice. But at the moment, the desk looks good from the front and back, but the side view looks kind of clunky. So to hopefully fix that, we're going to tilt the legs in by about 3 degrees. So very subtle. So the thing about this that makes it hard, for me at least, mostly has to do with keeping track of pieces. And that's because first, the pieces are mirrors of one another, which means every time you cut a 3-degree angle on one of your pieces, you have to cut the opposite 3-degree angle on the other piece. And 3 degrees is just a really hard amount of degrees to see. So if these were like 20 degrees, it would be way harder to accidentally cut something the opposite from how you meant to, because it would be really obvious to you. And it's also the kind of thing that because of the way all of these pieces are going to come together, if we cut one too short on accident, we're basically screwed. So I don't even know if this was worth it. But like I said earlier, I don't know where this piece is going to end up. If I knew that it would be in a room where you only ever really had a clear view from any sort of distance when you were looking at it, either from the front or the back, I would probably skip this. But my fear is that it could be in a room where maybe right when you walk in, you're looking at the desk from the side. So that's the first thing you notice every time. Also, sometimes having the legs perfectly vertical can create an optical illusion where they almost look like they're tilting the other way. I don't know why or how that happens, but it does. So we wanted to make sure that that wouldn't be the case. I'm not sure how much this entire desk is going to weigh when it's all said and done. I would guess somewhere in the 175 pound range, which isn't a ton, but it's definitely a size and shape that could be awkward to move around, and it's not something that you want to accidentally bang into walls. So we want to make sure that it's really easy for a person to be able to break it down into a few large chunks for shipping, getting through doorways, and that kind of stuff. Now, a lot of times people will ask us why we don't just use screws for what we're doing here. And there's two main reasons. First is that screws, the more you take them in and out, the worse your connections get. So basically, over the years, there's a way higher chance that things are going to start to loosen. And second is that these threaded inserts and bolts that we're using make it really easy to deal with wood movement. So I'm not going to get super into it here, other than to say that wood moves across its width over time. Not a lot, but a little. So with each one of these connections, what we're doing is making a hole that's bigger than the bolt so that the bolt can go through it and into the threaded insert and hold tight this way. But throughout the year, the oversized hole will allow for things to move this way. I guess there's kind of a third reason that's more subjective, but I think most people would probably agree that using a hex bolt just feels more upscale than using a screwdriver does. And usually you can get nicer looking hardware too. But basically, if we were to sell this thing for several $1,000s and then the end user gets it and needs to screw it all together versus using an Allen wrench and bolts, I don't know why, but that creates a very subtle but very different perception and quality. At least I think so. If you want to be a YouTuber, you have to grow a thick skin. People are going to call you every name in the book and nitpick everything they see you do. And honestly, I'm totally fine with that. But I did get a little bugged by a few comments in our last video. So you'll remember in the beginning of this video, I talked about how the chunk of slab we're using is the remainder of the circle table slab we built. Well, in that circle slab video, we talked about how the slab itself was one of the worst or roughest from its boule. And just like phloem, boule is another word that I didn't know 30 seconds ago. But basically it means the log sliced up this way into longitudinal slabs, and apparently it also is the name of a French bread that's round and crusty. Anyway, Big John, the guy at the lumberyard, even said, in many eyes, 90% of the world's eyes, probably an unusable piece. So a few people commented saying that he kind of tricked us into buying this slab. And I felt bad because he can't defend himself in the comment section. So I just wanted to say that Big John is a very honest and extremely likable guy. I think that comes across in the video. And by the way, I know I'm on a tangent here, but what you're about to see is Sean making the handles. And we had a lot of ideas, but decided to go with this design to tie in some pieces of elm slab back into the base. Anyway, like I was saying, John did not hard sell us these slabs, and the reason that we sold ourselves on them was because, honestly, a worse slab will usually make for a more interesting video. I guess that's another thing about being a woodworker on YouTube versus just being a woodworker. Your priorities get mixed up. If we weren't making videos, of course we would just pick the best slab possible to make our lives as easy as possible. But at the end of the day, it's not about doing things the easy way. It's about doing them the best way, whether that's the furniture, the video, or hopefully both. By the way, Big John, if you're watching, don't worry about those comments because some people had some very nice things to say. So yeah, that's being a YouTuber. You have to grow a thick, crusty skin, like a bull. Also, you have to be likable. You have to be like a bull and likable. For this piece, we decided to go with two different finishes. For everything other than the top, we did a water-based polyurethane, and the reason for that is it's going to leave the beech wood a lot more pale versus golden. Basically, we wanted as much contrast as possible between the slab top and everything else. So after we sanded everything up to 180, we did about 5 to 7 coats everywhere. For the top, you'll remember that a few minutes back, we had filled in all of the major cracks with epoxy. So after sanding all of that back, we filled in any little remaining cracks and holes with some CA glue. Then sanded the slab up to 180, making sure to pop the grain in between each grit with water. And for finish here, we used Rubio Monocoat. Anyway, I don't really have much else to say about finishing, but I know watching finish go on is a lot of people's favorite part of a video. So while we're putting it on, I'll just thank you for watching this video. Whether this is your first time here, or you've been watching since way back in the days when I was in my garage, thank you for watching and for taking an interest in this stuff. So way back in the beginning of this video, I said that we were going to overcompensate for the more subtle slab on this piece by going a little crazy with the base. With all the other slab projects that we've done so far, we've tried really hard to be restrained, making sure that the slab is the star of the show, and treating the base like more of a thing that's just there to hold the top in position. Now, I don't think that there's a right or a wrong way to go. And I think it should be a case-by-case decision. Whatever the slab needs, the slab gets. So in these shots, I've been going through all of my material and figuring out exactly where I want to get all of my pieces from. And once I've got that determined, putting some panels together. In total, I made 7 of them, and those would be for the desktop, the privacy panel, the cabinet sides, the cabinet top and bottom, and the cabinet center panel. So while the glue is drying on those, we can start working on our legs. I mean, for the desk. So we'll start off by prepping some blanks, which will yield our 6 pieces that'll make up the 2 leg subassemblies. On the front leg blank, I'm going to measure and mark out a 25-degree angle on both ends so that I end up with a parallelogram shape. And eventually we're going to cut these off, and that'll determine the angle at which the leg leans. But before we do that, I'm also going to mark out the taper that I want on each end of one side. So for example, this one is going to go from about 1.5 inches at the bottom to 4 inches at the top. And we're going to go ahead and repeat these steps for the other 2 blanks to mark out our back legs and our top stretcher piece. To make the angled crosscuts, we can use a miter saw or a table saw with a sled. Something like this Rockler crosscut sled is perfect for this kind of stuff. But if you don't have one, any regular miter gauge will work just as well. Basically, we're just going to lock in an angle and make a cut on both ends to create the parallelogram. To cut the tapers, you could use a tapering jig if you have one, but we're going to do it using a makeshift sled that'll hold everything in the perfect position and is repeatable so that you can make an infinite amount of these identical pieces. But we only need 2 of each for this piece. In these shots, I'm preparing to cut in my joinery for the leg subassemblies, and we're going to be using an angled lap joint. And because the leg pieces are 1.5 inches thick, and the stretcher pieces are only 1 inch thick, it'll make for flat faces on the inside, but this staggered detail on the outside that I think adds some visual interest. Next, we're going to make 3 aprons, which we'll use to attach the 2 legs together. And each one is going to be a slightly different shape to better match the angle of the base. It's a detail that most people won't ever really notice, but it'll be nice if they do. Now, because of the configuration that I'm building, I'll have to wait until close to the end of the build to actually glue these together. So I'm going to cut my joinery in now, and then just set them aside for a bit while I make the top. And I'm going to do it predominantly using the domino. That said, we're going to cover how to do it using dowels or pocket holes. And really, you can use pretty much any method that you prefer for this. Okay, so we had already put the desktop panel together, and now I'm going to scrape the glue off of it and sand it with 80 grit just to get it nice and flat. And then from there, it's really just a matter of cutting it to its final size and putting this chamfer detail on it. Okay, now let's set that aside so that we can build the cabinet, which is going to consist of a top, bottom, 2 sides, and a center panel, which will be biased towards the back side. On the front side, we'll install 3 drawers. And on the back side, we'll have some adjustable shelving. Also, on both the front and back of our box, we're going to add an inside bevel detail to all 8 edges. And then on our drawer fronts, we're going to add a bevel along all 4 edges of each drawer. And we'll also cover making these custom handles, which again can be altered if you prefer, or eliminated altogether if you want just some off-the-shelf pulls. Alright, so at this point we have all of our major components built, but we still need to get everything assembled. And the first step is going to be attaching our leg subassembly to our box. So I'm going to mark out a position for where I want it, and then hold the leg subassembly up to the box itself and transfer a line for where to cut the leg. To attach them, I'm going to be using these expandable washers and threaded inserts. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I built my box out of hardwood, and this will allow for the top panel to expand and contract along the width without any issues. And also this will enable me to take the desk apart so that moving it'll be a lot easier. Anyhow, after marking a few pilot holes in my leg, I can go ahead and cut in some threaded inserts and mortise in my washers. Now with everything dry assembled, I can size my privacy panel. And I would say that it's this step, along with the last step of attaching the box to the leg, that make the one-legged version of the desk more complex than the two-legged version. But hey, don't take it from me. Take it from the more authoritative version of me, from chapter 2 of our plans, project overview. Now, I'm going to say right at the top that the two-legged version with the box detached is by far the simpler version of this project. I would say it's honestly significantly simpler. And it's honestly probably the more... But all that said, and this is just my opinion, I think that the one-legged version with the box attached looks a little bit nicer. Okay, so moving on to some specifics with the one-legged version, the first thing to mention is that the privacy panel is totally optional. Structurally, you don't need it for this version, so I'd only put it there if you think that you'll use it to maybe hide some wires behind, or if you're just worried about people looking at, well, whatever goes behind the privacy panel. Okay, thanks, Chris. So I guess the important takeaway from all of that was that this panel is easy to include in the two-legged version and difficult to include in this version, but also not necessary in this version. So you might be thinking, what's so hard about this? Why not just throw some dowels or dominoes in there and glue it? And actually, you know what? Hit him with it, Chris. Why not just throw some dowels or dominoes in there, glue it and clamp it up and call it a day? And you could do that, but I think that it would just make the piece too big and heavy to move around. So I really wanted to use some sort of knockdown hardware to put it together. Another option could have been a few pocket screws through the panel and into the leg or cabinet on their respective sides, which would work, but I was worried that over time it might start to lose its grip a bit. And also, since I'm not the person keeping this piece and I'm not going to have access to it, I just wanted to make sure that I did something that was definitely a long-term solution. Even though what I'm showing is specific to the domino, a lot of the techniques that I used to help position my pieces and mark up where things would go would apply to using pretty much anything. And also remember that this part is totally optional. So if it's, God, okay, yes, we get it. It's hard, but it's optional. Let's move on. Moving on, and with my panel cut to size, I'll need to mark and cut everything into my privacy panel first, and then into my leg and the inside face of the cabinet. And there's a lot of measuring and marking and relative math here, and a lot of what gets covered is pretty universal to just sort of laying things out in general. And as I say in the plans, this part is totally optional. You can just skip this part. Okay, let's get to it. Okay, we're on the final stretch here. The last few things to do are, first, finally we can glue our aprons between our two, or well, I guess one and maybe a seventh leg subassemblies. And then after we clean those up, we can get everything finish sanded and finished. And then we can do our final assembly. So at this point, we have the following pieces: a base subassembly, a top, a cabinet, 3 drawers, a privacy panel, and 2 adjustable shelves. We'll attach our base to our top using some figure 8 desktop fasteners. And our privacy panel to our cabinet using our knockdown hardware. Then we can attach these 2 large pieces together with the knockdown hardware and the threaded inserts. And then reinstall all of our drawer hardware, take care of any fine tuning needed, install our adjustable shelves, and we're done. Today we're going to be building this giant L-shaped desk. Well, this is just the base that the cabinet that the desk sits on top of is going to go on. So there's going to be the base and then the cabinet, then the top, then there's going to be another corner leg here, and then one more leg over there. And actually, you know what? We'll cover everything in the video, so why don't we just get to that? All right, so this is a pretty big desk, which means it used a lot of wood, and wood is pretty expensive right now, especially walnut, which means that it cost a lot of money. So because of that, we paid extra attention to making sure that we use the wood as efficiently as possible. So the first several hours of this project basically just consisted of going through all of our boards and figuring out where we'd use each piece, and then milling everything up. And it took us a long time to mill everything, as you can tell by the movement of the sun along our back wall in this shot. All that said, while the desk itself is big, it's not really that complicated and really just consists of three main components: the legs, the cabinet, and above all else, the top. So the top is going to be a big L shape that's 88 inches along this edge and 100 inches along this edge, and then 30 inches wide. And that's a pretty hefty L. We're talking like a Helvetica extra black L here. Anyway, so after milling everything to just about an inch thick, we could start putting our two big panels together. So back when we milled everything, you might have noticed that we never jointed the faces of our boards. We just went right over to the planer. And the reason for this was that our joiner's only 8 inches wide, and in order to make our tops out of the material that we had, our finished boards needed to be wider than that. In total, we used 7 boards for the top. So each of the two panels consists of 3 full boards and then half of one of the boards that we ripped on the bandsaw prior to milling. So because these boards were so long and too wide to joint, as you can see in this shot, when making our panels, some of them were pretty wonky. So for us, that workaround was basically just a crap ton of dominoes. That said, dowels or whatever other mechanical reinforcement you like would also work. And what this is going to do is force the panel of the boards to be coplanar, and then due to the way that it's designed, the legs in the box will essentially act like giant cauls, and it'll hold everything nice and flat. So in other words, we're kind of just using brute force to give us the outcome that you'd normally get from proper milling. And in this shot, you can see our glued up panels consisting of 3.5 boards, which are still oversized in terms of width and length for now. So we're going to let those dry and we can start working on the legs. So here I've got some 8/4 material, and the first thing that I'm going to do is cut it into some oversized chunks that'll eventually yield our leg pieces. And in this shot, you can see that I'm using some templates to help me size things. So anytime I'm making shapes like this that have these kind of curved transitions and more organic shapes, using templates is my preferred method. And probably the easiest way to produce templates is by using a CNC if you have one, like you see me doing on the X-Carve in this shot. That said, you don't need to have a CNC to make templates. At this point, we've got a bunch of leg blank pieces, all cut and milled to a uniform thickness, which for me was about 1 3/4 inches. And next I'm going to use my joiner to establish one nice flat edge on each piece. So whenever we had milled our pieces about a minute ago, we ended up erasing the marks that we had initially drawn on, which is actually a good thing. So next I'm going to remark the template shapes onto my pieces, only this time they actually represent where the final piece will be cut out. Then with all 12 pieces marked, 4 pieces for each of the 3 legs, I'm going to put them into groups the way that I think that they're going to look best and label them to help me keep everything in order. So from there we can head back over to the bandsaw and just cut on the outside edge of our marker line. Except for in the transition curve areas, you can see that I'm going a little extra wide here and leaving a little bit more material, which we can refine later. Okay, so being the good thinker aheader that I am, I guess, way back when I was designing the templates, I did a few things to help make my life a little bit easier. So first was that I made the joint faces parallel with the front and back edges of the entire assembly, which means that I can use the table saw to rip the pieces and get the perfect angle. Next, I also made it so that both of these pieces are equally thick at the transition area, which means that I can lock my fence down one time based off of my template and then cut all 6 of these pieces at the same time. And the last kind of planning ahead thing that I did was I designed these joint faces both at 90 degrees, which meant that I could cut them both on my crosscut sled. And that means that the only 2 sort of tricky joint faces to cut are these, both of which are essentially just 10-degree angles going in opposite directions. So technically you could cut these on a miter saw if you have one that's dialed in nicely. I don't though, and personally I feel that I get a more accurate result using a table saw. Anyway, and the way that I do this is by using a temporary plywood sled. So this is a sled that I've probably used on, I don't know, like 5 other projects, and I'll just keep using it until it's too small to be useful anymore. So with that done, I can put my template in position with the joint face perfectly flush along the cut edge of the sled, and then I can set up 2 fences. One of them is going to hold the piece at the proper angle, and the other one's going to act as a stop so that my pieces all come out to the same length. Then I can cut the joint faces on all 3 of my work pieces, and I know that they're going to be identical to one another, as well as identical to the template, obviously. So with the first 3 joint faces cut, next I can adjust my sled and cut the remaining joint faces. And again, I'll cut all of those 3 at the same time so they're identical. So at this point, the pieces are looking good at the joint faces as well as along their outside edges. Instead, we still need to do a ton of work on the inside shape and the ends of the vertical pieces. But first we're going to just glue them up, and then we can continue to refine things after they dry. So to assemble, again here, I'm going to use some dominoes, but dowels or beadlock tenons or really anything that you have access to would work just as well. And because we're going to be caking on the glue pretty heavily here, I like to throw a couple of these Rockler project mats down on my table. Helps to keep things clean, and actually it's kind of fun to pick off the dried glue afterwards. So as it turns out, the first day of work on the cabinet's pretty redundant to what we've already done, so I'm not going to go over it in detail. It was basically more just breaking down wood, milling, and then gluing up into oversized panels. So now that we've sufficiently glossed over that, let's pick up where our panels are dry, rough sanded, and ready to become a box. So the only sort of extra, I guess, preparation that we had to do when making these panels versus making our desktop panels was paying attention to the orientation of our boards. Basically, the top and the 2 sides come from 3 boards, where we made sure that the grain would flow up the left side of the left panel, across the top, and then down the right side of the right panel. Now, a lot of this might be overkill since the cabinet's going to be sitting under a desk, but whatever, it's good practice to stay in, and you never know. Maybe someday somebody will notice it. But in any case, we're going to go ahead and cut miters on all 8 ends of the 4 boards, and then we can rip everything to its finished width. Alright, in this shot we've got the top and bottom panels back to back with their inside faces up, and we're going to clamp them together so that we can cut a dado in that's going to hold our vertical partition. So to do that, we've clamped a piece of scrap plywood that has a straight edge across the width of both panels, and then used a flush trim bit with a 1/2 inch diameter to ride along the plywood, which will cut the dado. And we're using a plunging base on the router here so that we can stop the cut about 2 inches shy of the front edge of the panels. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But because things are getting kind of technical now, this is probably a good time to answer a question that I know we're going to get asked. And the short answer is no, there's not going to be plans for this particular desk. And I know you didn't ask for it, but here's the long reason. So the main reason that we're building this piece was for a custom order for a client named Charles. Whereas when we make plans, the pieces are specifically designed to become a plan. And because it takes about 300 man hours to produce one set of plans, it's not really realistic to make plans for every piece. Plus, we already have a desk that we did a set of plans for, the Deskwire. And while I know taste is subjective and they certainly look different, I think that both cater to the same kind of sensibilities, which is to say, if you like one, you'll probably like the other. And finally, this desk is gigantic. So I just don't think that there'd be enough people out there interested in building it for themselves to justify a plan. Plus, if you were absolutely hell-bent on having an L-shaped desk, you could pretty easily take the information in Deskwire and turn it from something like this to something like this. So if you want to build a desk or a chair or a coffee table or a dining table you get the point. Check out the plans and I'll have a link in the description. Okay, so while I was rambling about plans there, Sean had cut a rabbet along the back edge of all 4 panels and attached a piece of hardwood to the front edge of a piece of walnut vineyard plywood that's going to become the vertical partition. Then after cutting in some dominoes, we could glue the whole thing together. So while this is in clamps, next we could fit in the partition. And as you'll recall, the dado for the partition is 1/2 inch wide, but the partition itself is 3/4 of an inch wide. So first we cut a pair of roughly 1/8 inch deep shoulders. Then after doing that, we could trim off the front couple inches of the shoulder and install the partition. Alright, while Sean was taking care of the cabinet, I continued working on the legs to refine and finish the shape. So the first step here was to use some double-sided tape to attach all 4 template pieces to our legs. Then I'll use a flush trim bit to work my way around the entire inside perimeter, flush trimming my work pieces to my template. Except for in the transition areas where I kind of float away a little bit. And we're going to take care of this last little bit of material in a minute by sanding. So I'm basically just working my way down. Then when there's just a little ledge left, I'll switch from a bit where the bearing is at the base to one where the bearing is at the tip. And I just realized that I'd been referring to this as a flush trim bit before, but this is a templating bit and this is a flush trim bit. So apologies for the confusion. And anyway, you can do this by hand or on a router table. But once you switch, you have to remove the last little bit of material in one pass, which is why I like to work my way down pretty much as far as I can go before switching. Now, since I still had 2 more legs that I had to do this exact same thing on, I decided to do a little experiment and cut the other 2 on the X-Carve Pro. Okay, so with all 3 of my legs cut now, next we can clean up that little transition bit on the inside corners. So like I mentioned before, I left this transition proud back when I was template routing, and on the CNC legs I also left a little flat spot so that I could do the final shaping by sanding. So to take care of this, it's pretty quick, and because there's nothing technical happening here, it's not crucial that all of these be perfectly identical. You really just want a nice look and a nice transition. So I know it's very small, but in this shot you can see the difference between what the seam looks like coming off of the sander versus coming off of a router, where you get these little tiny bits of chip out. Again, it's very mild, but it's just slightly cleaner, so I like to do it that way. Okay, next we're going to grab our plywood sled again and establish a new cut edge. So now this thing's a 32nd of an inch closer to its eventual death. And this time we're basically just making a giant crosscut sled that we can use to lop off the parts of our leg verticals that extend up past the top of the horizontal pieces. So after making this cut on all 3 legs, technically we could flip the legs over or rotate them 180 degrees and do the same thing on the parts that extend past the bottom, but we're not. Instead, what we're going to do is set our table saw's fence to whatever the maximum height of our table is supposed to be, minus the thickness of our top. Alright, so in reality, the next thing that we did was start working on the joinery for how the legs and the top are going to attach. But I'm actually going to come back and talk about all of the joinery at the same time a little bit later. So now we're going to jump around in time a little bit. And the next and final thing that we have to do to our legs is add in a couple of profile details. Namely, we're going to add a chamfer to the inside perimeter of our leg faces all the way around. And then we're going to add what we always call a thumbnail profile to the front edge of the legs. And this is a profile where you get a nice combination of a rounded edge while maintaining a really crisp line. When we last saw the top, it had been glued up into oversized panels. So here we are with it good and dry and doing some very rough sanding. Just basically removing any extra glue and fixing any areas where the boards might not be coplanar. From there, Sean's going to use a track saw to make a miter cut on the inside corner of each of the top pieces, and then cut them to their finished length by making a 90-degree cut. So by the time he had finished doing that, the top's looking like this, where the length of each piece is dialed in, but they're still overly wide. And you'll see why we did that in a minute. But before we do anything else, we need to join the tops in an L. Now, for the purposes of transporting this thing and getting it into a house, we needed to make the entire desk be able to break apart into sections. So not only individual legs and the cabinet, but even the top needed to break apart. So in order to do that, we used this domino connect hardware, which isn't hard to use, but it's one of those things that you do just infrequently enough that you basically need to relearn how to do it every time.
Cutting dominoes is just quicker. They are all completely suitable for this. The reason that I tend to go with a domino, actually there's two reasons.
Now, I know that it looks a little rough in this shot, but the top still needs a lot of sanding and cleanup, so it's going to look better when it's done, I hope. But anyway, as I said before, the top is still too wide, and that's because we're going to be cutting this inside radius. So in this shot, Sean's marked a line that's 30 inches away from the back edge, and we can rip most of the way across the length and stop just a little bit before we get to where it would curve. And technically you could do this on a table saw, but it's a pretty heavy piece and I think Sean doesn't like to ask for help. That said, what is definitely a one-man operation is finishing off the curve. So to do that, we made ourselves a little inside radius piece. But anyway, cutting this was kind of a giant version of what we did on the legs. So just more good old-fashioned template routing. So with that all looking good, next we can fill up any knot holes with some black epoxy and let those set up. Okay, so when we last saw the cabinet, we had glued it up into a box and added a vertical partition. So in the cabinet, we're going to have 3 drawers and 1 door. For the drawer boxes, this is something that we've covered a bunch of times, and we have a dedicated video on Sean's channel that gets into all the technical stuff. So I'm going to link that video if you want to know more about drawer boxes. That way we don't have to talk about it again here. But the one tip that I will give is if you use Bloom drawer slides, Bloom, like we do, seriously get this jig from Rockler. I don't like telling people that you have to have something because obviously you don't, but this thing makes it so much easier and honestly it's cheap. So this is as close to a must-have declaration as I'm ever gonna make. All that said, jumping back into this project specifically, the only sort of special thing that we paid attention to for the drawers and doors was the grain on the fronts. So for the drawers, the way that we did this was by gluing together one panel that's essentially as big as the opening, and then cutting that into our individual drawer faces, as opposed to what might be the more kind of obvious way that you would think to do it, which would be cutting each drawer front from a board. So what that does is you end up where the only place where the grain transitions is right in the middle of our middle drawer front, rather than here and here, where we also have the gaps between our drawer faces. And you can argue which is more discreet, but to me, this is what looks the best. And I guess it kind of depends on the wood you're using. Alright, then the only other thing that we needed to do to our cabinet was build in the toe kick base thing. So thankfully to build this, I was able to use offcuts from the actual cabinet, and pretty much all I did was build a really shallow box using miters, and I sized it so that it's 4 inches shorter than the cabinet and 2 inches shallower. And to assemble it, I wanted to use the fastest approach possible. So for the 4 exterior pieces, I used some tape to hold everything together and then reinforced each corner with a little block on the inside. Then to add 2 more stretchers, I just cut a pair of pocket holes on each end and screwed it all together. Alright, so at this point, all of our components are made and we're ready to assemble. So here we're going to be bouncing around in time a bit to talk about how everything came together. And we're going to start with the legs. Initially, I had thought that I would cut a bevel to join the 2 legs together, but the more that I thought about it, that seemed kind of overly complex. So instead, I used my trusty old sled to rip an amount of material off the back of one of the legs that was equal to the thickness of the other leg. And what this is going to do is make it so that from the inside corner, which is the only visible corner of the leg, this area right here will appear equally thick on both faces. So basically the same thing as if I had mitered it. To attach the legs to the top in a removable way, we're going to use some threaded inserts and some oversized holes to allow for the top to expand and contract while still having a nice connection. So to cut those in, we're going to start by drilling a small pilot hole in the top of our legs. And the reason that I'm using a portable drill press is because I want to keep this pilot hole as straight as possible. And because these legs are 3.5 inches wide right here, it's not going to be able to reach all the way through. So after making the first pass, I'm going to drill deeper without using the drill press. Then I'm going to have to switch to a longer bit that can reach all the way through. And then from there, I'm going to have to put in an even wider bit. And with this one, I'll start by drilling up partway through the underside and then going from the top to meet where the first cut was. That way I don't get any blowout on either side. And what all this is going to do is give me an oversized hole that a bolt coupled with a washer can fit in and wiggle around, but that it won't fall through. So with all that done, I'm going to use this little template that I always keep around to cut a mortise on the underside of the leg that all the hardware can sit in. And this is going to do 2 things. First, it'll make it so that the hardware is invisible unless you're laying underneath the desk. And second, by making this mortise about 1.25 inches deep, it'll make it so that our 3-inch bolts will extend 3/4 of an inch beyond the top of the leg and eventually into the underside of the top. So in total, I'm going to cut 4 attachment points like this onto our 2 legs. 2 here, and then 2 more here. Attaching the cabinet to the top is similar but slightly trickier. Basically, it would look weird if the cabinet was attached directly to the top. So instead, there's this sort of intermediary piece that bridges the gap, which I made out of some of the leftover leg material. So for this one, I'm going to clamp the connector piece on top of the cabinet positioned where we want it to eventually be attached. And then I drilled a small pilot hole that went through the top side and down into the cabinet, extending all the way through the inside of the cabinet. Then again, I'm going to drill an oversized hole through the cabinet, just like we did with the legs, and then use a router to mortise out the hole that the washer and bolt can tuck up into. For the threaded inserts themselves, I could use that pilot hole that I had initially drilled through the connector piece, just enlarging it and drilling slightly deeper than 3/4 of an inch. Then we're going to use some dominoes and glue to permanently attach this piece to the underside of the top. For the legs though, we don't really have a pilot hole that we can reference, so instead, with the desktop connected and flipped upside down, we're going to need to just kind of position our legs where we want them, make a mark through the holes for the bolts, and then install the threaded inserts there. Alright, while we're putting the finishing touches on this one, I'd like to invite you once more to check out our woodworking plans. Whether you're looking to build a desk, a coffee table, a dining table, a dresser, a different coffee table, a different dresser, a rocking chair, a dining chair, a lounge chair, a smaller dining table, or a whatever this thing is, we've got something for you. And as for this desk, while it won't be a plan, if you want to take inspiration from it and build something, that's awesome. I say go for it. Personally speaking, I think that Sean and I would both agree that this was a fun change of pace. It's not often that we get to build something of this scale. And going in, while it can feel pretty daunting, at the end of the day, I'm pretty pleased with the outcome. So maybe instead of continuing to describe it as a big L, I'll call it a big W. Today we're going to build 2 different and complete DIY desks. Okay, so the first desk is going to be really simple. So we'll start off by cutting our 3 large panels to size. And if you don't have a way to make these cuts, you could actually have the fine people at the lumberyard do this for you with their panel saw. So here are the dimensions for those pieces. If you do that, one thing to be aware of is that when you tell the person to rip it in half, they're probably going to set it up to cut at 24 inches. And assuming that their blade is 1/8 of an inch wide, that'll result in a piece that's 24 inches wide and a piece that's 23 7/8 of an inch wide. Which isn't the end of the world, but yeah, I'll let you decide how much you want the person at the store to hate you. But assuming that you want to DIY it, or DY it, I guess the other one's redundant, what you'll do is set up a long straight edge to rip the entire length of the plywood at just shy of 24 inches. Split the plywood into as close as 2 equal halves as you can. And remember to factor in the distance from your base plate to the blade on your circular saw when you're setting up your straight edge. Now we can set aside the half that'll be the top, and with the other piece, we need to cross-cut 2 pieces at 28 3/4 of an inch long. And you can set this up the same way that we did with the first cut, but if you have a large square, now might be a good time to utilize it. To attach our 2 leg panels to our top, we're going to clamp them together and then just use some screws. And you don't need to be nearly as picky as I'm being, but if you want perfect screw placement, here's a diagram that shows what I did on each end. And with that all marked out, I'm going to drill some pilot holes with this bit that'll also countersink my screws. And you can pick up one of these from rockler.com, or again, you can be less fancy. Okay, now I'm going to sand the pieces, paying extra attention to making sure that I round over all of the sharp edges. And I'm not going to be putting any finish on this one, since I want to be able to reuse these panels later. As you can see in this shot, this thing is super wobbly at this point, so the next thing I'm going to do is hold my tool chest next to one of the side pieces to measure the distance between the underside of the top and the top of the tool chest. Then you can cut a few strips to fill that gap, or if you want to get fancy, make a U-shaped piece like this. And honestly, that's about it for this one. The only other thing that I did was make this little plate that I'll screw to the back for some cable management. Basically, I can hook up whatever I need to and then use some zip ties to keep them looking clean. All right, let's move on to the intermediate DIY desk. So this is one of those projects that you could do with a limited set of tools. I'd say a drill, a sander, some clamps, and either a track saw or a table saw, and 1 sheet of plywood. So I'm going to use both a table saw and a track saw to try to show you how to make the various types of cuts using either. And furthermore, if you're using a track saw, you could use a traditional kind or something like the ACS, which is essentially a track saw on a table, which really helps with speeding up some of the setup times and just kind of makes things a little bit safer. But either way, regardless of what tools you're using, the first step is going to be breaking down your sheet of plywood. So I started by making 2 partial crosscuts 19 inches deep at 24 inches from one end and 34 inches from the other end. And by the way, you can use a circular saw instead of a table saw or a track saw as well, which I assumed you assumed. Next, I'll cut these pieces free, and then really we're just gonna work our way through cutting out a bunch of rectangles, and you can do this however you like. But the only important thing would be to just leave each piece slightly oversized for now so that you can refine them after. And here's an image of their finished sizes if you want to pause and write them down. And here's a better image. And we'll go into more detail on some of these when we start working on them. The only extra thing to note for now is for these 2 pairs of oversized rectangles, which will become the 4 legs eventually. We're gonna laminate them together into 2 rectangular chunks. And once those have dried, we can start cutting those out. So the first thing that you'll wanna do is cut your blocks into rectangles the following sizes. And the red pieces are the front legs and the blue pieces are the back legs. And actually the length dimension doesn't really matter right now, so that's just the shortest that they can be. So just make sure that you leave them long for now. Alright, so in this shot you can see that, for example, on the front leg we need to cut an angle at 20 degrees. So we can go ahead and do this on our table saw with a crosscut sled or a miter gauge or using a track saw or even a miter saw. Either way, with that cut, next we'll measure out 30 5/8 of an inch from that cut and then make another cut at the same 20-degree angle. So now we've got a parallelogram. Now we can measure and mark out the taper that we want to cut. So on one end, I'll mark out 1.5 inches, and then on the other end, 3 1/4 inches. And I like to draw out the taper just to help me visualize things, but you don't technically need to. Really, the only important marks would be to transfer the marks on both ends down across the thickness of your piece, and make sure to keep track of which side of the line your blade should go on. To make the taper cuts on a table saw, a tapering jig is ideal, but if you don't have one, another option is to make a quick sled. To do that, I'll grab a piece of scrap plywood, lock my fence in position, and establish a clean edge. And the position of my fence doesn't really matter. All that matters is that I don't touch it from now until I'm done cutting all of my tapers. Next, I'll clamp my workpiece to the sled so that the offcuts are just hanging off the edge that we just established. Then I'll take a few more pieces of scrap and screw them to the sled to keep the piece in position. I usually like to do 2 along the edge of my workpiece, 1 at the back of the workpiece, and a few more to create a bridge like this, which will act as a clamp. And with that all set up, I'll cut my first leg. Now I'm going to take the offcut and flip it around 180 degrees and take another pass to make the other leg. And there you go, 2 identical legs. Next, we'll need to repeat the same step of making a parallelogram, marking out the taper, and cutting them on the sled for the back legs. And here are the dimensions for that piece. And in reality, you should cut out both parallelograms first and then make the sled for your tapers, rather than having to reset things up multiple times. Now, to do it with the track saw, you don't need any jig, and a lot of the concepts are largely the same, so I'm going to explain it in a quick animation just to give you a different look. So you'd again start off by cutting your piece into a parallelogram. Then you'd mark out the taper that you want to cut and line up your marks with the grooves in the tabletop. Or drawing out the line here would actually be useful because you could just line that up with the track. Either way, with your piece positioned, clamp down a fence to reference that position and make your first cut. Now again, you can flip the offcut around 180 degrees and make the second cut. And again, you'd end up with 2 identical legs. Okay, we're not done with the tapers just yet. Actually, only halfway, as we still need to make 4 more pieces, which will become the sides for our top assembly. Which, by the way, I should mention is totally optional. I'm including it because my kid's gonna be the one using this desk, so I think it'll be useful to store some items and to keep his pencils and stuff from falling off. But for an adult, maybe not as useful. You can make that decision. But if you do choose to include them, here are all of the dimensions that you'll need, and the process is exactly the same. The next step is to cut the stretcher pieces that'll connect our two legs together. So to do this, I'm going to set my pieces up like this so that I know that the tops are coplanar, and then I'll position the bottom legs 25 inches apart. Then I can mark out where I need to cut the stretcher to match the inside angles of each leg. And you can cut both of these pieces to be identical, but when it comes to attaching them, remember that we're making legs that are mirror images of one another, since the legs are 2 pieces thick, but the stretchers are only 1 piece thick. So just keep track of that. Next, I'm going to put together the leg subassemblies as well as the L-shaped assemblies for the top portion. And I'm going to use glue and dowels to do this. To assemble the rest of the desk, I'm going to use a mixture of pocket screws and regular screws. And since it's kind of hard to tell exactly what I'm doing, let's cut to a quick animation. So I put 2 pocket holes on each end of my 2 apron pieces, and those will connect our leg sub-assemblies together. I also put about 6 pocket holes on the inside face of each apron along the top edge that'll eventually be used to go into the desktop. Next, we'll connect our drawer box housing pieces, and this one will get screwed into the side of the leg subassembly, and the other one will get attached through the back of the front apron. And each of these is also going to get a few pocket holes on the inside top edge to attach to the desktop. We'll also put some pocket holes in our privacy panel, as well as the back panel for the top piece. And once we have the desktop on, we can attach the top piece with a few screws through the underside of the desktop. So back in the real world, to help me position things, I'm using a few business cards as spacers and then just clamping and screwing together. No glue. Okay, finally with all of my pieces put together, I can put the tabletop on. But before I do that, I'm going to cut a bevel along the front edge and both sides. And then I can go ahead and make my drawer box. So we're going to keep this super simple, and I'm just doing butt joints and glue. Then I'm going to cut a bottom piece that's oversized and glue it on as well. And I like to let it sit for about 5 minutes before I clamp it up so that it doesn't slide around. Then once it's dry, I can sand it flush and start attaching my hardware. But before I do that, I'm going to strike a line 3/8 of an inch from the edge, and eventually I'll reinforce the joints with some screws here as well as through the bottom. But we'll do that after the hardware is on so that we can make sure it doesn't interfere. For the drawer front, I decided to cut this angular piece, but if you think that it's funky, you could make it a rectangle. And to attach it, we'll just do a few screws through the inside of the box and into the back side of the face. Alright, let's back up for a second to talk about the finish. So obviously you can use anything that you want, but for Baltic birch plywood, and especially for a desk for my kid, I like water-based poly. And rather than waiting until the very end, I like to finish pieces as I go before I assemble things, just because it's easier to get to them. So for pretty much everything, I put on 2 coats of finish, then lightly sanded with 320 grit sandpaper, put on another coat, and then aggressively rubbed it with a brown paper sack after it was all done, just to remove any little dust bits that found their way into the finish. So that's a total of 3 coats on everything, except for the top, which got an extra 1 or 2 coats.
Leave me alone. Take a walk, mister. Hey, take a walk, but not in front of me. Ooh, that's a slither.
And for the drawer front, I had this yellow paint matched to match the yellow of this wall control panel that I installed on the back panel. So you guys might be used to seeing these things in my shop, and they're super useful, but I've never used them on a project like this. But with all the little shelves and accessories that you can get for them, I'm sure that they're going to be equally useful. Plus, I think they just kind of look cool. The last thing that I wanted to do was make a handle for my drawer front. So I looked through my scrap, but I didn't really see anything that I liked. So I opted for a piece from my 1/2-inch stash instead. And after getting it all shaped, positioned, and ready to attach, I decided that I didn't like it. And actually, it was purely aesthetic anyway, since the easiest way to open the drawer is by grabbing it from the underside. So with the elimination of that, we're done. I hope you enjoyed watching these desk builds. If you want to leave a comment and prove that you made it all the way through, include this super secret code word in your comment. And actually, I'll give you a choice of 2. So use either yucca or insomnia. Okay. Thanks for watching, everybody.